Hey guys, welcome to Let's Read Final Fantasy 15 Dawn of the Future Part 6. The beginning of the end. Because after the final glaive, there is nothing left. There is nothing left in Final Fantasy 15 left for me to cover. I was just sharing some sad faces with chat over that. But I nearly forgot to hit the record button and this is going to be two different parts. Part 6, Part 7. Episode Noctis is 100 pages exactly. I can't promise I'll stop at the 50-page mark, but I'll try to get halfway through it. So, usually I would put the art that's on the inside cover of the book, because each part has, artwork, and I've been pretty good about that, putting what that is. But I actually I'm not putting the artwork up for that because I want to save that for a later bit because it's a gorgeous colored piece and it's really powerful and impacting, and no, it's just gonna have to wait. So I actually went and pulled some CGs from game because episode Noctis has the least amount of art. So this is just the overall Dawn of the Future art. So it's a huge break and is roughly halfway. Oh, okay, thank you, Maud. Yeah, we'll see where we are time-wise, throat-wise. I'll stop and go get dinner at that point. And everything. And, pacing-wise. But yeah, let me get rid of Dawn of the Future promo image. And we'll start with episode Noctis. The final glaive. Myriad shadows writhed in the chill night air of the Citadel courtyard. Enemies were everywhere, but the certain knowledge that he would have to fight hordes of every step of the way elicited neither surprise, nor confusion, nor even the slightest trace of fear. Step by step, he descended the great staircase. Gunfire erupted, waves of bullets flying from enemy barrels like swarms of angry insects. He wove his way between them, flayed, and we're off. Blade flashing into his hand as other opponents began to rush the stairs. Each clash was over as quickly as it began. One, and then another, and then another. Steel shrieked, and ash-colored automatons went rolling lifelessly down steps just as they had ascended. But something was amiss. A person. Persons? Who should have been there with him was not. Did I always fight alone? Just as he felt the memory might be drawing within reach, a bullet grazed his ear, as if bent on preventing him from recollecting. He paid the injury little mind, simply turning to face the next incoming enemy, blade quick to send it flying. The initial sense of unease, dislocation, was growing. These things I'm fighting. What are they? Their armor was fashioned from some kind of lustrous dark metal. As he continued to cut his way through the ranks of empty, soulless suits, it occurred to him that they shared neither hue nor design with the Magitech troops he'd known in some distant past. A black haze, much like demonic miasma, emanated from their surfaces, an eerie aura like that of some ghostly apparition. Most disconcerting of all was the smell of their weapons, a thick, acrid stench of gunpowder. Niflheim's infantry had never used weapons like these. Members of the Horde continued marching up the steps, weapons firing wildly. Over and over again, he dispatched them with warp strikes, a seemingly endless cycle of attack. He heard the thud of defeated foes falling, as they tumbled back down the stairs. That, too, was different, not the same sound that defeated MTs made. The only thing these new foes seemed to share with the Empire's automated infantry was an obnoxious degree of persistence. A flash of red, then another. Half a moment after he saw the muzzle flashes, the unmistakable report of firearms resounded in his ears. But they were too slow, he thought dismissively, and their lack of aim made them little threat. Where the hell am I? It looked like the Citadel courtyard, but there were many small differences. The color of the place was wrong, or rather, it didn't have any color, just streaks of monochrome gray. His unease was transforming into alarm, into the distinct sensation that this world was not his own. He pivoted on his heel, suddenly determined to confirm his suspicions. Wow. I'm just off to a start. A Q. I mixed few and casual, which were the next two words. There goes my coaster. Just pause to take a drink. start that paragraph over. He pivoted on his heel, suddenly determined to confirm his suspicions. A few casual swipes of his weapon downed the enemies behind him, and he was vaulting back up the steps he just managed to descend. The memory returned promptly. Ignis. He was nowhere to be found. Neither was Gladio or Prompto. Why had it taken him so long to mark their absence? That was far too strange. Something definitely wasn't right about this place. He stepped inside the citadel. It was dark and seemingly empty. He saw no one else. The sense of foreboding grew worse. This was the citadel he knew, and yet at the same time, it was not. He walked to the throne room doors, placed both hands upon the enormous handles, and pushed them open. Inside, he encountered a darkness even more profound, pierced by one faint beam of light that landed on the throne. Noctis was drawn to it. He climbed to the throne and sat. This does not belong to me, but neither does it belong to another. Straight after he had that thought, a voice boomed in his mind, seemingly coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. A voice with a force and gravity that were utterly inhuman. Before the chosen unfurls one possibility. To mortal mind, a dream. Though man would choose, he has but one way forward, ordained above its mortal fate. Ordained above is mortal fate. You know what? I don't care. It's Bahamut. Fuck him. To the crystal, all possibility is memory, and all memory etched within. The episode in the courtyard had felt half known to him and half strange. A possibility. A dream. If Noctis were entangled in a dream, that would account for the way the places and events had felt familiar and yet off. It would explain the mysterious absence of his companions. Behold the heart of the crystal, wherein lies the soul of the star. It is in this place that the king will gain the power he needs. Receive the memories inscribed in the crystal, that the true king's calling may be fulfilled. The word calling stirred something deep in his mind. He cast back through his memories. A place called Gralia, the imperial capital, Zegnota's keep, and then it all came flooding back. The endless hordes of Magitech troopers and demons. The battle that never seemed to end, no matter how many foes were slain. "We're getting nowhere!" Gladio had shouted. Then Prompto. "They just keep coming!" Noct, you must go on alone. If you can obtain the crystal's power, we may yet be able to turn the tide. Elsewise, we are all like to perish here. Iggy's right. It's our only chance. We'll manage somehow. Just get moving. With Prompto's final encouragement, all three were in agreement. So Noctis had run. He left his three companions to fight by themselves and made his way to the crystal alone. He ran until his chest was tight and his legs ached. And then he was plunged into an absolute darkness that blotted out the light of the world. All sound ceased, even that of his own breath. Touch, smell, and taste, too, were gone, and he was left with the solitary sensation that he was falling at an impossibly slow pace. "Please, help me stop the demons," he'd pleaded as he stretched out his hand. He remembered it all now. This was the heart of the crystal. He'd been dragged inside by a force that defied all resistance, and the last thing he'd seen before sinking inside was a face whose mere memory sparked rage, that of Arden Izunia. "Arden Lucis Kylum is my proper name," the man had said, looking Noctis straight in the eye. Lucis Kylum? What could Arden have meant by that? As if responding to the questions now seething in his mind, the darkness faded and was replaced by the boundless, blinding light of the crystal. The glittering peaked, then receded, gradually replaced by blue sky and green earth. Noctis found himself overlooking a landscape bearing no resemblance to any place he knew, but he felt a strange certainty that it was Eos of the distant past. God damn it. Distant past. I'm not even reading that fast, man. In the age when the crystal was brought to their star. Just take another drink here. He saw a sanctuary in which the crystal had been enshrined. Surrounding it were scattered homes and fields of wheat. The landscape began to change. Forests fast receded, and the wilderness was tamed and tilled. The people grew in number. Noctis could see them, Oh my gosh. Quotidian scenes swirling by at a dizzying pace. Sorry, quotidian was hyphenated, and I was like, whoa, what is this word? He witnessed the countless joys and sorrows of their lives. An inconceivable quantity of information flooded into his mind at once. The fact that he could make clear sense of it had to be thanks to the otherworldly crystal in which he hung suspended. Memories inscribed in the crystal. That was how the scenes before him had been described. It seemed to have something to do with his calling as king. Perhaps he'd need all the information recorded here. Perhaps it was important for him to understand what had happened in the beginning, when the crystal and the ring of light were first brought to the land. Two men came into focus, their names familiar. Arden. Somnus. Noctis saw that they were brothers, heirs to House Kylam, meant to support each other and rule the land together. To symbolize that bond, they were entrusted by their father and mother with a pair of weapons, two swords that were as one. The Rakshasa blade and the blade of the mystic. One parent and then the other departed from the world, and not long after, the two brothers stood in opposition. At its base, it was a matter of ideology. The two differed in opinion as to the proper mindset of a ruler. The younger deceived the older, and the older hated the younger for it. Noctis had known nothing of this, and the knowledge stunned him. He had been so sure that Arden possessed not a shred of decency, that no matter how much he reviled the man, it would never be enough. Instead, he was now witnessing a man who was utterly selfless, consumed by the constant labor to relieve the suffering of his people. Even more disorienting was the discovery that Arden had been in love. Her name was Era Miras Fleuret, the first oracle. When the pair were together, talking and laughing, Arden was neither savior nor secrelat. He was simply an ordinary man. Ordinary, too, were his desires. "Oh, Era, pray, be with me always," Noctis heard the man say. Arden dreamed of a simple happiness, one that had nothing to do with either star or God. It was a happiness every person should be able to know, and thus Arden had never for a moment thought it might be stolen away from him. Was that why Arden had killed Luna? Because he knew firsthand the extent to which it would devastate Noctis? It was still unforgivable. It didn't matter that Arden had been a savior laboring for his fellow man, and the death of his love was no excuse. To claim an innocent life simply to see an enemy suffer was an act that lay far beyond the bounds of absolution. But if Arden was beyond pardon, then so too was Somnus for the web of lies he used to ensnare his brother and ensure his own place as founder of the new nation. It was Somnus who had killed Era and planted the evil seed that would culminate in Lunafreya's death. And what about me? Noctis thought. Don't I deserve some of the blame too? The Covenants had chipped away at Lunafreya's life. They were forged for Noctis, that the true king might be favored with blessings of the gods, and each one left Lunafreya weaker. Even had Arden's dagger not ended her life, the oracle's time in the world would surely not have been much longer. Noctis, too, had played a part in her demise. Sacrifice is unavoidable in the pursuit of a strong nation. That was the belief of the younger Kylam brother. If Noctis accepted Lunafreya's death as a necessary evil to see the darkness purge from the star, would that make him any different than Somnus? Did he, then, have any right to condemn the actions of his forebears? The memories of the crystal swirled on, pushing Noctis's uncertainties aside. He saw Arden, imprisoned in the depths of Angel Guard. He saw Somnus, setting forth to exterminate demons across the land. The citizens lived in peace and stability, and Lucis continued to grow as a nation. Others rose and fell, some more ruthless than Somnus, and others far too gentle. There was one who wore a mask throughout her life and reign, one who suffered a tragic loss of the oracle during his rule, taking up a trident and duties in her stead. One brought Lucis an extraordinarily long era of peace. One was murdered on the very night of his ascendance to the throne. Okay, so quick aside, this is actually pretty cool, because I think they're referencing some of the dungeons. If you read, or like at least some of the rulers that inscribed some of the monoliths in the dungeons, which I did not play because those are a post-game thing and they can take a lot of time. But there are these tiny little plaques that you can read throughout the dungeons, and they're each from the perspective of a different king. And there's one king that even talks about how he failed his love, the oracle, and how he took up trident in hand. to finish what she started. Because I remember wondering if that was Somnus, but I guess it's not. And I'm guessing the rogue is the first one, wearing a mask and implying a queen. So that's, I mean, I think they're talking about the dungeons. Alongside Lucis rose other new and powerful nations. There was Tenebrae, ruled by House Fleuret, the bloodline of the Oracle, and, like House Kylum, heir to the powers bestowed by the gods. The Empire of Niflheim donned the mantle of Solheim, seeking to return Magitech to the world. The Accordo Protectorate flourished through trade and grew wealthy. The people of every nation were alike. They laughed, struggled, fought, and wished for happiness. Noctis saw that throughout the world, just as there were no two individuals exactly alike, neither were there any so different as to set themselves apart from all others. Every person resonated in some respect with every other, and in some respect, every person was unique. The time allotted to any human passed swiftly and without mercy. Death came for all, leaving only lifeless husks to pile in the earth. The thoughts each mind held inside were lost forever, gone without a trace. Yet, at the same time, the reality that they had once lived and walked among their fellow humans could not be denied. A familiar face appeared, like driftwood surfacing in a muddy torrent. Some 2,000 years after the founding of Lucis, Arden was carried from the depths of his island prison. His recovery brought to Niflheim in the means to produce their Magitech infantry en masse. The Empire's borders surged outward, and as Niflheim grew, Arden too accumulated power. The one man who controlled demons ensured the spread of darkness throughout the world. When the threat of all-consuming darkness seemed close at hand, Regis was chosen to stand among the ranks of the kings of yore. Around the same time, Noctis was born, and the Lucii pronounced him to be the true king. Noctis saw his young self sleeping peacefully in his father's arms, still blissfully unaware of the burden of fate. He saw his father force back tears. Though man would choose, he has but one way forward, ordained above is mortal fate. To the crystal, all possibility is memory, and all memory etched within. Perhaps, if Versdale had failed in his attempt to penetrate the depths of Angelgard, Arden would still be hanging from chains in his wretched stone cell. If Arden were still captive, and the crystal maintaining the silence of that age-old secret, the time foretold when darkness would cover the star would still be far off. Perhaps Regis would still have the honor to stand as one of the kings of yore, but there would have been no need to name Noctis as the true king. He would have been merely another successor in the long line of Lucis, and his father would have lived free from grief of knowing his son's bleak fate. But neither, then, would Noctis have encountered the Merilith. There would have been no grave injury in his 8th year, no visit to Tenebrae to recover, no time spent with Lunafreya. And that was not all. There would have been no marriage planned, no journey to Accordo with his friends. The nature of his companionship with Ignis and Gladia would have been different, more removed, more distant. Without Arden, Versdale's forays into Magitech would have been far less successful. No mass production of MTs, and that meant Prompto would not exist at all. Queen Silva Via Fleuret would still be alive and in good health, continuing her duties as Oracle. Her children, Lunafreya and Ravis, would still reside at Fenestala Manor in peace. Behold the heart of the crystal, wherein lies the soul of the star. It is in this place that the king will gain the power he needs. Ravis. Noctis heard the words the High Commander had spoken to Ignis. Even in death the Oracle does not rest. Only once the darkness is dispelled is her calling truly fulfilled. And as in life, I know she will confront that challenge with a smile on her face. They'd stood among the devastation in Altissia. The altar, like everything else in the city, lay crumbling in the wake of the Hydrian's trial. Between Ignis and Ravis lay Noctis's own unconscious form, sprawled across the flagstones. Lunafreya was there too. She was dead, yet somehow she arose and proceeded to the water's edge. As she walked, her feet did not tread upon the earth. To the Oracle, death did not mean dissolution. An Oracle soul ascended in holy glory, joining the divine after its passage from the mortal realm. The Oracles received no burial, as they left nothing behind to intern. "Oh, sister, please don't go," Ravis pleaded as she floated out over the water. Ravis's words were thick with anguish. For the last remaining member of House Fleuret, this was a parting far more cruel than death. He would not be allowed to weep over his sister's lifeless form, robbed even of the chance to properly mourn her passing. The crystal swirled on to new memories, and Noctis observed the path that Lunafreya had walked in life. He saw Fenestala Manor in the wake of the occupation, Lunafreya standing before Gentiana with her head bowed. "I have been confined to Fenestala and may no longer move about freely," she said. "But I have not forgot my vow as oracle to forge a covenant with your mistress Shiva. I intend to petition for imperial leave to travel, and once it is secure, I assure you I will fulfill my duty. So I would ask that you please entreat the Glacian for patience on my behalf." "The oracle seeks a covenant with the Frostbearer for the sake of the crystals chosen, that he might have aid in the time of need soon to come?" Gentiana asked. "That is my wish." "Very well." Gentiana's form began to change. She rose from the ground, arctic light pouring into her body until her skin shone icy blue. Lunafreya's eyes grew wide. Noctis imagined the same look of shock on his face when he, too, had witnessed Gentiana's transformation. "All this time," Lunafreya whispered, "the Glacian was at my side?" Shiva's voice resounded in gentle proclamation. "Let the covenant be forged." "My gratitude to the compassionate Glacian and the favor she shows mankind," Lunafreya responded. Noctis saw her cheeks flush with a mix of pride in completing one of her duties as oracle, and joy at knowing that she had been watched over so closely since birth by one of the six. If you hear any jangling, I'm sorry, that's my cat. Sometime later, Lunafreya was able to proceed to Ral Muel, the training ground for the oracles. Once she had formally inherited the title, her days grew busy with journeys across the land to provide relief to the afflicted and to comfort the bereaved by performing the rites of requiem. It pained Noctis to think of the comfort and leisure in which he'd spent his own days around the same time. Then came the fall of Insomnia. Regis entrusted the ring to Lunafreya, asking her to bear it safely to his son, and a certain pair of glaives saw the oracle's safe evacuation from the city. Flames rose throughout Insomnia as Lunafreya fled, slipping between buildings on the verge of collapse, speeding along crumbling roadways, her life ever in peril. "I'm sorry," Noctis thought. "Luna, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Do you mind? I'm trying to read here." Oh, she minds. "I'm trying to read here. Noctis is being very repentant right now." After that long, harrowing night, Lunafreya journeyed on all by herself, ultimately making her way toward Accordo. Noctis reflected on where he would have been during her struggles. Somewhere along his first journey beyond the walls of Insomnia, staring wide-eyed at the world and its many wonders, in the care of his close companions. When the regalia had broken down shortly after their journey began, the four of them had taken turns pushing the car to Hammerhead, complaining all the way. But even then they'd, in some sense, been enjoying themselves. Things were lighthearted and fun. Now Ravis's biting sarcasm, the anger he felt towards Noctis, no longer seemed so inexplicable or unwarranted. "Witness his splendor and glory. All hail the chosen king," he'd sneered on confronting Noctis at Archeol. Ravis had watched his own flesh and blood dedicate her life to an ungrateful, ignorant child. Lunafreya expended her own existence for the sake of Noctis's success, and Noctis had regarded her sacrifice as nothing more than her ordained duty. When Ravis looked upon Noctis, he saw not a king, but a coward who was undeserving of the title. Looking back, he found it hard to imagine himself to be more lacking in understanding or maturity. Noctis had spent so much of his time sulking and moping, stuck in his own self-absorbed world, that he'd been unable to see the hands held out to him or the others supporting him from behind. "How long will you remain the protected? The king entrusted the role of protector to you." "Get a grip! Pull your head out of your ass already!" He remembered the moments he'd been chastised first by Cor and then Gladio. Each time he'd felt only defiance. He was trying his best he knew how. What gave them the right to criticize, and why did he have to put up with it? In truth, he was running away. When he claimed to be trying his best, it was for his own benefit, to stave off the ugly truth that perhaps he could do better, and that he only wanted to make things easier for himself. His companions must have seen right through him, and still they were kind and patient enough to stand and fight by his side. In Altissia, to save Noctis from Arden's malevolence, Ignis had gone so far as to chance the ring of the Lucii. Noctis watched as the scene unfolded, Ignis declaring, "I swore an oath to stand with Noct and keep him safe. Whatever it takes, I will protect him." The kings of yore descended. They approved of Ignis's devotion and lent him their power, but in exchange, they took his sight. Upon Noctis's recovery, Ignis had refused to speak of the episode, knowing it would weigh heavily on the young king's conscience. The advisor's lips stayed tightly sealed, enduring a darkened world while Noctis was blind even to his companion's compassion. "Remember, those ain't your bodyguards. They're your brothers. Trust in 'em. Always." At Khayyam, Sid's words struck him hard. It forced Noctis to think about what his friends were feeling and what they each had sacrificed. Through it all, they continued to hold their hands out to him. To trust his companions meant accepting their help with the full knowledge of what it would cost them. Accepting help without that regard was not building a relationship of trust. It was the act of a child, still hopelessly dependent upon others. Up to that point, Noctis had depended on others for nearly everything, and all the while he'd sulked and complained. What could he offer back to those who'd helped him nonetheless? What they had given him was priceless, beyond recompense. "Receive the memories inscribed in the crystal, that the true king's calling may be fulfilled." The vision spun once more, this time with intense speed. He saw himself in combat with Arden, the Accursed's fall to darkness now complete. Was this the future? It had to be, or at the very least, it was not the past, nor one of the possibilities of the past. Noctis's own aged appearance suggested this battle was impending, the crystal hinting at a moment that was yet to come. Then, after Arden's defeat in Insomnia, Noctis saw himself upon the throne, wielding the Ring of Light and calling forth the kings of yore. He would finally destroy the accursed soul in the realm beyond, and Arden would perish once and for all. Gather strength, O chosen. The fate of this world falls to the King of Kings. His providence consecrated in the divine light of the crystal. So it is ordained. The revelation of Bahamut. But the vision that unfolded alongside the Draconian's words was hard to accept. The old kings arrived, and there on the throne, it was Noctis's own life that was ripped away. Blinding light burst forth from the ring, and the chosen king was torn from his mortal flesh and carried to the beyond. There, once Arden's end was wrought, Noctis's soul shattered into countless fragments of light, vanishing without a trace. A power greater than even that of the Six, purifying all by the light of the crystal and the glaives of the rulers past. Only at the throne can the chosen receive it, and only at the cost of a life, his own. The King of Kings shall be granted the power to banish the darkness, but the blood price must be paid. To cast out the usurper and usher in dawn's light will cost the life of the chosen. Many sacrificed all for the king, so the king must sacrifice himself for all. Now enter into reflection, that the light of providence shine within. When Noctis looked down, he was seated on the throne of kings. Not the one at Insomnia, but the one situated here, inside the crystal. So it wasn't a dream, he thought. He stood and began to walk. His steps felt light and uncertain. How long had the vision lasted? He had no means to gauge time's passage. It had felt like only a moment, and it might have been so, but within that moment he'd observed 2,000 years' worth of history. He'd watched as more people than he could ever count came into the world, lived their lives, and passed on. He'd known every one of their thoughts. Now, do you mind? Yes, you. I'm live. I can't stop this. Like, there's all this heart-wrenching revelations about, like, Luna and Ravis and himself and, like, Ignis, and my cat is here. Just doing her thing. I can see your readouts. Stop it. Now all of it was at risk. If darkness shrouded the star completely, all life would cease. And if the star itself perished, there would be nothing left of man, not even artifacts or ruins to hint at what it had once been. I can save the star, if I lay down my life. With the darkness driven away and the safety of the star ensured, the world of man would continue. Countless other joys and sorrows would fill the future. However, is that really how it ends for me? Noctis brought his hands before his eyes. Use the ring, draw on the crystal's power, and receive new strength. Then strike down Arden with these same hands. Securing the future was supposed to be as straightforward as that. But death. To be erased from the world. That was the fate that awaited him. It was terrifying, more so than he had wanted to bear. He wanted to run, to never have to think of it again. I can't. Now that I've seen what I've seen, I'll never be able to escape that knowledge, or my fate. He thought again of the endless faces recorded by the crystal. They brought depth to the concepts he'd assumed to be simple before. The star. Our world. Beyond those words stood every day lived by every life that was or had been, as well as every life yet to be. If I abandon my calling, all of them will vanish. At the same time, he couldn't help note that he, too, was one of those lives. He'd been granted time on this star. His parents had eagerly awaited his arrival in the world. And although Noctis had lost his mother while still young, he'd been loved all the more by his deeply caring father. Ignis had been ever at his side, taking care of his every little need. Gladio, constantly honing himself for the day when he would serve as Noctis' shield, was stern with him when necessary, and at other times protective, like an impenetrable wall keeping Noctis from all harm. Prompto was there as a close friend, plain and simple, providing Noctis with invaluable time when he could forget his title and the burdens it imposed. Their journey together had been cut far too short. I'll lose all of that. It'll all be gone. He couldn't bear the thought. He did not want to die. He looked forward to the day when he could live together with those he cared about in a world that finally knew peace. Yet even without the true king's death, Eos had no future. To secure a tomorrow for everyone else, he had to give up his own. It's not fair. I won't. I refuse. The memories from the crystal, the knowledge of myriad lives and deaths, once again swirled through his mind. He could never escape them. They were too heavy a burden to abandon. A light shone as if to soothe his agitation. Noctis glanced up and found a familiar face staring back. Dad? Regis looked the same as he had in the last memory they'd been together, on the steps of the citadel as he bid Noctis farewell. The king stood with sword in hand. His expression, too, was familiar, gentle, yet with a faint trace of sorrow. It was a sadness that appeared but for an instant, like a cloud momentarily passing across the face of the sun. It was fleeting, yet Noctis had never failed to notice it in days past, nor did he miss it now. You knew all along, didn't you? Noctis asked. He recalled the vision shared by the crystal, of his father on the day Noctis was revealed as the prophesied king. You cared for and looked after me, knowing exactly what my future held in store. Noctis recalled the chiding comments of friends and relatives. You're too soft on the prince, they told Regis. Others questioned the king's decision to enroll Noctis in ordinary public schools. Unsuitable for a prince's education, they'd said. The criticism had poured in again from all sides when Regis allowed Noctis to begin living in an apartment on his own. To Noctis, too, it had seemed nothing more than a father's doting on an only child. He'd assumed nothing deeper, certainly not that all those choices were born of a determination that Noctis derived the most joy possible from the short time he had. That was why you tried so hard to smile when you sent me away. At the end, too, Regis's careful regard was apparent. He had arranged for Noctis to travel by car, to ensure that the journey would take time. The prince had been sent with a minimal retinue of 3. The trip was one last chance for Noctis to forget his role as prince, to experience the wide world beyond Insomnia's walls, and to deepen his bonds of friendship. The smile given from father to son that day was a parting gift, well wishes for coming travels, for when they were inevitably over, so too would be the life of the traveler. I hated you for it at the time. You sent me away with a smile, and I couldn't imagine why. I'm sorry. It must have been painful for you. A faint smile crossed Regis's lips. The late king shook his head, and then finally responded in words. It is a parent's duty to feel concern for his child and to worry for his happiness. Those are feelings that needn't be returned. It is enough for the child to depend on his parents and let himself be treasured. With time, even moments of hardship or frustration are looked back upon fondly. Dad, now you are grown. The time for you to be dependent on others has come to an end. You are a man, a king. His father had always been generous with praise throughout all of Noctis's childhood, and he'd always felt proud to have his father's approval, but all of that paled in comparison to the pride he felt now. Then the smile faded from Regis's lips, and his tone grew stern. A king cannot lead by standing still. A king pushes onward always, accepting the consequences and never looking back. Regis held out the grip of his glaive. Use it to protect the one in your heart as well as the ones you love as brothers. Noctis accepted the sword, feeling its weight. Choose, his father seemed to say. Not a choice of whether to yield the fate placed upon him, but a choice of the future Noctis wished to see. His options were by no means great in number. It was possible that, though he could not see it, he had no means to choose at all. But whatever path he walked, his father seemed to want him to walk it decisively and after much careful consideration. I understand, he said. As if satisfied by Noctis's answer, Regis nodded and began to fade. The things Noctis wanted to protect were clear. There were the people he cared about and everything connected to them. There was the kingdom he'd inherited from his father, the people he'd met during his travels, and the lands in which they lived. Everything was essential and everything was integral. Madam. Okay, at the break I'm going to chase the cat out of my room. The loss of one brought emptiness and sorrow to others. If everyone and everything was connected in one great puzzle, then no piece could be neglected. More than anything else, he did not want Lunafreya's sacrifice to be in vain. She'd expended her own life for the Covenants. It was, he admitted, the one life he cared about above all others. He wished she could live again, but if that were not to be, he would at least see that evidence of her life persisted, that her memory might be carried forward into the future world. With his father's sword in hand, Noctis lowered himself onto the throne in the crystal and commanded himself to think. Think well, that you might choose well. By the Covenants awakened, the Six have seen the coming of the prophesied hour, a time when the crystal shall have shed the entirety of its light onto the ring. Only then, once the sacred ring is replete, can the true king complete his ascension. Okay, there's a break, and I'm going to chase the cat out of my room. Hang on just a sec. I'm so sorry. Get out! Come on! You little scamp! Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry. I really love that bit. I remember getting really emotional the first time I read it, and then there's my freaking cat's collar just jangling like it's Christmas up in here. Oh my goodness, kitty cat. I literally had to shut her out of my room. There we go. Noctis heard the distant roar of thunder. For a moment, he believed he was having a dream about the Stormbringer. He opened his eyes, but the darkness beneath his lids was replaced by a darkness that seemed to envelop everything. Perhaps, he thought, this too is a dream. As his eyes adjusted and his gaze swept about, Noctis realized he was on Angel Guard. He'd seen this ancient stone prison before, in the vision shared by the crystal. It was here that Arden had been sealed away by his brother. The roaring he'd heard then was surf, not thunder. He was not certain how long he'd lain there sleeping. Last he remembered, he was seated on the throne in the heart of the crystal. Now he was here, seated atop cold stone. Noctis stood. It was a strange sensation, as if he were making use of another's body rather than his own. The feeling lasted only for a moment, and by the time he was out of the cell itself and making his way to the outside, he felt his limbs moving as surely as they had in the past, or, in truth, more so than ever before. He found that he knew the tunnel leading to the surface, though he'd never walked it himself. He had the crystal's memories of Arden being led into his prison and then led back out by Verstile 2 millennia later. It was a simple, straightforward route, and the memories of the 2 journeys were more than enough to guide him to the surface. Once outside, he was hit with the strong scent of the ocean. The sky was dark. He saw that in his absence, the demon's influence had drawn a shroud over the whole world. "Be calm," he assured himself. "You are the true king, and it's this very darkness that you have come to banish." He descended the rocky slope down to the island's single cove. Even at a distance, he could see a ship moored there, as if awaiting the king's return. Noctis grew nearer and realized it was one he knew well. The royal vessel on which he'd made his journey from Kayam to Altisha. It felt like a reunion with an old friend. The ship was in good repair. Someone, mortal or otherwise, must have kept an eye on it. It was precisely as he remembered it from Sid's work was complete, and they'd set off across the waves. The royal vessel was not the only friend waiting. As Noctis approached the craft, he heard a familiar bark and a friendly snuffle. "Umbra!" The dog seemed to appear from out of nowhere. He sat at Noctis's feet, and Noctis leaned down to pet the thick fur of his ruff. Umbra shook him away. "What's the matter, boy?" With one rear leg, the dog made several swipes at a spot farther back on his neck. Noctis followed the motions, realizing Umbra was carrying something. It was where he and Lunafreya used to tuck the notebook when sending messages back and forth. Familiarity of the exchange hit him like an unexpected blow to the chest. The last time Noctis had squatted down like this to take the notebook from Umbra, he'd been at Cape Kayam, just before boarding the same ship moored beside him now. Noctis had carefully opened the notebook's cover and flipped through the pages to Lunafreya's latest message. "Waiting for you in Altisha." Back then, he'd been so certain that he and Lunafreya would be reunited soon. No longer would theirs be a relationship confined to written words. They would finally be together in all ways, never to part again. He recalled with a vivid clarity in the way that his heart had leapt at the thought. It only made the current sting more painful. He recalled also the morning in Altisha when he realized that the notebook, the arrival of which had always delighted him, would now serve only as a constant reminder of loss. Umbra shifted impatiently, unknowing of this inner turmoil. He nuzzled against Noctis's crouched figure, urging him to accept the delivery. All right, cool it," Noctis told the dog. He pulled the object free, realizing it to be a different, smaller notebook. He flipped it open to the first page, and on scanning it, his eyes widened, a mix of surprise and confusion flooding his mind. "How is this possible?" he wondered aloud. Inside, in the same flowing script of the brief notes he'd seen countless times before, was written page after page crammed with thoughts, letters, and journal entries. "Luna? She's alive?" It was hard to believe, and yet the hand was unmistakable. The first message, "I'm safe," was written in a hasty scrawl. She must have been in some great hurry as she began. But those were the only words that lacked the care and good form of Lunafreya's usual impeccable penmanship. 12 years they'd exchanged messages. Noctis knew the shapes of her letters by heart. Her voice seemed to emanate from the words he read now. The more he read, the more certain he became. The notebook may have been different, but it was, beyond any doubt, something prepared by Lunafreya and meant for him. There, on the shores of Angelgard, Noctis read. He learned of Lunafreya's revival and the new calling bestowed upon her. He learned of the world as it was now, devoid of daylight and uninhabited, save for Lestalem and its environs. He read about Lunafreya's shock and bewilderment waking into this new world, of the new, inhuman power she'd gained, of her travels through former imperial lands, felling demons along the way, and of her new friend, a young woman named Sol. As Noctis scoured the pages, following every stroke of her pen, his vision began to blur, until his eyes were too full of tears to read further. "Luna," he wept. She's alive." This whole time he'd believed her lost, the one life he'd wanted to protect more than any other. When the crystal had revealed the true king's calling, one thought had been more devastating than any other. Though Noctis could promise a future to the world in exchange for his own life, It would be a future not graced with Lunafreya's presence. But now he held evidence that she was alive. Thank the gods, he'd wanted to say, but his voice grew hoarse and thick with sobs. He traced a finger over the words of the notebook, the words that she had strung together, true and certain. Wiping tears away with the back of his hand, he continued to read. Here and there he found a date noted in small figures, 766. At first he thought it was a mistake, but the number appeared over and over. Noctis's own journey with his friends had begun in ME 756. The scene shared by the crystal had spanned from ancient times up to that same year, which was to be expected, since Noctis had been drawn inside to learn of the past. The Draconia had showed glimpses of a future in which Noctis defeated Arden, but the god had given no hint of the year in which the event might take place. 10 years, Noctis mumbled to himself. He'd not imagined the crystal might need so much time to pour its energy into the ring. There hadn't been the slightest notion that this calling might keep his companions waiting so long. Did they still have hope? Were they still awaiting his return? If they had indeed waited all these years, then it was crucial that Noctis hurry and find and rejoin them. They would fight side by side as brothers once again, and this time, Noctis would be ready to keep them safe. He would not only save his retainers in Lunafreya, he would see Dawn return to the world for all. Not one more life would be lost. Noctis couldn't bear the thought of any more deaths. And Lunafreya, never again would she have to offer up her own life for the sake of others. Her duties as Oracle be damned. No longer will I abide in a world where there is such sacrifice, he vowed. The writings of the notebook did not detail what Lunafreya's new calling might entail, but if that too involved her sacrificing her life, he would do anything and everything to prevent it. From now on, Noctis would see an end to all such things. On the final page he'd found written, "Waiting for you at the Citadel." A few pages earlier, there had been another passage that drew his attention. Lunafreya again mentioned the inhuman power she'd been given, a strength not meant for mortal hands, as well as her hesitation to use it. What did she mean? What was this power of which she wrote? Thinking to send Umbra with that question, he found an empty space in which to write, then realized he had no pen in hand. Just my luck, he sighed, then realized there was no need to write. They'd see each other soon. Noctis had his own business at the Citadel. Thanks, Umbra, he told the dog. I'll give this back to Luna myself. Umbra gave a single bark in response, signaling his understanding. After ruffling the thick fur around the dog's neck again, Noctis urged Umbra aboard the vessel, then hopped on himself. When they pulled up alongside the pier at Galden and disembarked, Noctis couldn't help but voice his surprise aloud. They really are all gone. Not a soul was in sight. In the past, Galden Key had been a resort, bustling at all hours with all sorts of people to come enjoy a moment's respite from the daily grind. During the daytime, the blues of the sea and sky shone so intensely they were almost blinding. At night, dozens of lights lined the walkways and hung from the ceilings to keep the dark ever at bay. It was a place bright both to eyes and spirit. Now, not a single light was lit. Inky darkness covered everything. The pier stood lonely in the water, no longer a host of vacationers enjoying casual spells of fishing. As man and dog walked along its planks, the only sound was of their own footfalls. The instant Noctis had emerged from the stone corridors of Angelgard and observed this pervasive darkness that was not night, he'd suspected this world would be far different from the one he remembered. Lunafreya's account, too, had given warning. Uninhabited, save for Lestalem. He grasped the concept intellectually, yet the reality still took him by surprise. The complete absence of people at Galden Key left him feeling as if perhaps everyone in the world had vanished, and now he alone was left. Even when he tried to reassure himself this was not the case, unease still hung heavy upon him. Noctis heard nothing from the world alongside from the rolling surf. Then, without warning, Umbra was barking. Not a hostile bark, warning of danger, but a bark of recognition. Someone friendly was approaching. "Welcome back, Your Majesty." Words spoken aloud. A human voice other than his own. Noctis had to pause to be certain he'd not imagined it. He looked in the direction of the sound and could just make out someone running towards him. "I'm not wrong, am I? You are the king, right?" The speaker appeared to be a young woman, about 20 years of age, more or less. A shotgun was strapped to her back, and Noctis presumed her to be carrying a variety of other armaments. As she drew near, he heard the clinking of a great deal of metal. "Huh," the woman added. "You're a lot more handsome than I would have expected." She stared at him without any hint of reserve. Noctis began to wonder if she might not be so unknown to him after all. "And you might be?" he ventured. "My name's Sol." His hunch proved correct. So this was the companion of whom Lunafreya had written. The walking armory who was good at cards and bad at cooking. "I was wondering how much longer you were going to keep me waiting," she said. "You've been waiting here for a while?" Noctis asked. He could see that it would take more than a few demons to face the young woman, yet it was still hard to fathom anyone waiting long in a place so desolate and devoid of all other souls. Clearly, Galden was no longer any manner of haven. "Don't get me wrong, it's not like I was here 24/7, but I've been coming by 2 or 3 times a day just to check on the place." She grinned. "Guess I ended up pretty lucky with the timing." But the smile lingered only for a moment. Sol's next words were solemn. "There's something you need to know," she began. "Luna's alive." Had he heard it from Sol's lips before reading the notebook, it would have been too much to take in. Noctis would have been at a loss for words, and quite likely unwilling to believe, his logical mind dismissing the possibility outright. It was fortunate, therefore, that Umbra had reached him first, bearing that small but incontrovertible bit of proof. "I know." "You do?" Sol's surprise was apparent. And as well she should be surprised. Noctis and Lunafreya had never told anyone else of their quiet correspondence. There had been no explicit promise between the pair to keep the notebook and its contents secret, but as the messages continued, it naturally began to feel like something private, a matter shared only between 2 young lovers and Umbra. If anyone else had been aware of it, perhaps Gentiana was the only one, but even of that Noctis wasn't certain. "Talk about a letdown," Sol mumbled. "I thought you'd be blown away by the news." "Sorry to disappoint you." "Nothing gets past the king, huh?" she said. Then, "Anyway, we got bigger fish to fry. Come on, car's this way." Noctis recalled the location of the parking lot. He did not need Sol to lead the way, but followed nonetheless. They passed through the quay's main building and crossed the narrow boardwalk, through drab surroundings of endless gray. The vibrant hues Noctis remembered of Galden were nowhere to be found. As they crossed from boardwalk to shore, Sol said, "You sure are trusting." "Why wouldn't I be?" Noctis responded, perplexed by the comment. Sol made a face, equally perplexed. "I mean, you don't even know me? You've never seen me before in your life." "That doesn't mean I have any reason to doubt you. You're a friend of Luna's, aren't you?" To Noctis, that alone seemed reason enough to trust her. "Then, I believe you're here to help me." At some point along the way, he realized Umbra was no longer with them. The dog seemed to have run off or vanished, as if his task was specifically to ensure Noctis' safe rendezvous with Sol, and now that his task was fulfilled, he was free to return to wherever it was he'd come from. It occurred to Noctis that the timing was too perfect to be a coincidence, and that was exactly why Umbra had come along on the vessel. Sol began to speak, but was interrupted by her smartphone. The ringtone was a familiar trill. For an instant, it had Noctis remembering an earlier time. "Oh, come on," Sol was saying on the phone. "Your timing is almost creepy. How do you always seem to know right when stuff happens?" Sol flicked her eyes at Noctis. Once more, Noctis felt a premonition about who was reaching out. "That's right. I'm with him now," Sol said. "You want to have a word with him?" There could be no doubt now. Ignis, Gladio, or Prompto. So which of the 3 was holding the phone? Noctis felt certain it had to be one of them, but he couldn't make out the voice on the other end of the line. "Huh? Oh, yeah, we'll be there soon," Sol said, then breathed a small sigh as she slipped the phone back in her pocket. "Who was that?" Noctis asked. "Gladio. Says he's got some visitors, so he can't stay on the phone long. But they're near Hammerhead. We can meet up with them there," Sol added. "By visitors, he means they've got some demons to take care of." Noctis gave a small laugh. What a Gladio way to put it. He envisioned his sworn shield in battle, the man's great sword arcing effortlessly through the air. Then an unpleasant thought struck. "Are all 3 of them okay?" Noctis asked. Prompto would be at a considerable disadvantage in this new era of darkness, with his strong preference for guns. And if Ignis had not regained his sight, survival in a world overrun with demons would be no easy feat. What if one of them has... Soul's interruption was merciful. Of course they are. Could anything kill those three? She laughed. Prompto spends most of his time around Hammerhead trying to impress Cindy. He helps out whenever she needs a little muscle on the road. Ignis hunts too. Says if anything, he's more used to the darkness than we all are. It seemed that Soul was quite close with all three. They're going to be real glad to see you. Not just your retainers either. Everyone's been anxious for the king to return. So they'd been waiting after all. For 10 long years. Everyone in the world had carried on, believing this day and this hour would come. We ought to hurry too, Soul said. Come on, jump in. Noctis slid into the passenger seat at her urging. No sooner was his door closed than Soul had set the vehicle in motion. So instead of Talcott, we get Soul. So instead of seeing Talcott, a grown boy, we get Soul. So it's a bit of a bittersweet trade, because I really did like seeing grown-up Talcott and all the cactuars like that you gave him. If you gave them to him on his dashboard. But I also really like Soul. So I'm assuming Talcott's off helping probably around Hammerhead, or he's helping the hunters. Because he pretty much is a hunter, I believe. He's 17. God, he's a year... He's 17. He's a year older than Iris was when Noctis last saw her. Talcott erasure. Oh, I'm sorry. I think there's also Iris erasure in this. They could only cover so much. Oh yeah, Iris was 15, not 16. I don't know why I keep thinking she was 16. She was 15, you're right. Yeah, I think there's both Talcott and Iris erasure. But they're only, but yeah, there's only so much they can do, because this is, again, DLC, so. And I mean, Soul's gotta fit in somehow. So, I don't begrudge her taking Talcott's place. Because we know that Talcott is off being incredibly helpful somewhere else, bless his sweetheart. As Soul drove, she related the story of her encounter with Lunafreya and their first 3 days together. There I am, cruising down the highway on my bike, and out of nowhere, this woman in white rolls right out onto the road. She rolled out onto the road? I know, right? Figure she probably slipped off an embankment up above. She was in a real hurry. When Soul had slammed on the brakes, Lunafreya had jumped right in the sidecar without a word. She was being chased, Soul recounted, almost casually. Apparently, the thing had been after her for a while. But that bike's an antique, you know? Doesn't get the kind of speed you need to outrun a determined demon. Especially not if you're lugging around extra weight. So I make a point of mentioning it to Luna. As a joke, right? And guess what she does next? No idea. She goes, right, what should I dump? And flings the bag with all my food on it out on the road. Noctis snorted, at which Soul griped. It was not funny. Food isn't easy to come by out in the wastelands. I was so mad I was fighting back tears. The next day we had to go back and pick it all back up. Soul began to talk about what a pain it had been, how they'd crawled around in darkness on their hands and knees, picking up cans one by one. As she recounted the action, she mimicked their actions, stooping low and reaching her arms out to swipe up imaginary cans, not seeming to care that in reality she was behind the wheel of a moving vehicle. According to Soul, Lunafreya had been much better at finding the cans. That was pretty much how it always went, right from the start. Luna was full of surprises. Same name as the dead Oracle, then she tells me she is the dead Oracle, then she turns out to be crazy strong even though she's got that dainty little princess figure. What do you mean by crazy strong? Lunafreya had mentioned in the journal entries that she was battling demons alongside Soul. Noctis assumed she would have handled herself well enough given her training, but he wouldn't have expected this walking armory to describe the Oracle as an outlier in terms of physical strength. The way she fights, you know? Soul responded. Packs a real punch. Terrible at cards, though. Oh, but there was this other game we played, and she was unbelievable at that. 5-Finger Fillet. You ever heard of it? Noctis had. The game where you stab a knife between your fingers? It involved spreading one hand palm down against a table, then using the other to stab a blade down into the spaces between fingers, moving back and forth as quickly as possible. He'd played it with the guys on the road a few times. Ignis hadn't approved. It was so frustrating, Sol continued. She claimed it was her first time, but she was going faster than me. Apparently, her brother was real good at it. She said she was just copying what she'd seen him do. Noctis was surprised to hear that Ravis had played the game. It seemed the man had another side Noctis had never seen, far removed from the stiff, unapproachable high commander they'd encountered at Archeol. Maybe Ravis was more easygoing in the presence of those he was close to, or maybe he'd been another person entirely before his mother died. I'm just going to chip in and say, with my new Ravis feels with this playthrough, I'm super happy about the extra Ravis content we're getting in this book. Just little details like Ravis playing five-finger fillet and then Luna just copying him and being really good at it. It's really heartwarming. Sol kept on talking. But the thing that really floored me was when Luna said she was going to face off against Arden. Claimed it was her calling ever since she came back to life. Noctis turned involuntarily to look at Sol. Did she really say that? The words gave Noctis a start. For a moment, he thought he must have misheard. Was that truly the new calling that Lunafreya had written about? How could she be the one destined to stop Arden? That was the true king's identity, bestowed upon him by the Draconian inside the crystal. At Noctis's evident disbelief, Sol scrunched up her nose. Please, couldn't make this stop off if I tried. Sorry, it just caught me off guard. Guess I can't blame you. I felt the same way. Told Luna that it was a joke if I've ever heard one. It was strange, though. Nowhere in the notebook had Lunafreya clearly spelled out what her new calling was, and she made no mention of going after Arden's life. If anything, she seemed to be suggesting the opposite, writing that she hoped to speak with Arden. Her message on the final page also told the encounter of the soul with the meeting of the first oracle at Romuel, and of her plea to deliver Arden of his suffering. He recalled the entry's words. I imagine how painful it must be for you to think back on what Arden has done, but I beg for your understanding. I would attempt to speak with him. I think that perhaps... No, now is not the time. I shall explain in detail when we are reunited. Waiting for you at the Citadel. And then there was the question of why Lunafreya was approaching Arden at all. This was the man who had stabbed her at the altar in Altisha. Though the covenant she'd forged had already worn her life down to a thin edge, Arden had delivered the killing blow. Yet her words seemed to indicate an honest desire to communicate with him, rather than to seek revenge. Something pivotal must have happened for her to feel that way. If Sol's claim was correct, and Lunafreya had indeed been called to kill Arden, the notebook's message was all the more troubling. It suggested that Lunafreya had turned her back on the god's will. For one who had always lived a life of prayer and dedication to the gods, such a decision would not have been made lightly. In the crystal, Noctis had learned that the Ring of the Lucii provided the sole means to destroy the immortal accursed. Lunafreya wasn't in possession of the ring, and neither was she a descendant of the Lucius Caelum line, able to wield it. He could see no logic in sending her to confront Arden. Why would the Six call on her to do so? Why send two people for a job that required one? He then remembered another passage from the notebook, where Luna had mentioned the new, inhuman power she found herself possessing, as well as the disquiet it invited. Tell me, he asked Sol, did Luna mention any sort of new power she was able to use? He intentionally omitted the word inhuman. Whatever this power was, he was reluctant to describe it in the way Lunafreya had. Sol stared straight ahead and answered stiffly. Yeah, she can absorb the scourge. The breath caught in Noctis's throat. There was only one other person who possessed a power like that, and the crystal had revealed the tragedy it had drawn down on him 2,000 years ago. She claimed one of the gods gave it to her so she'd be able to face Arden. Do you know which god? Was it the Draconian? I don't know. She never said. Regardless of the source, Noctis wanted to know why Lunafreya had been given the power to draw the Star Scourge, and why she had been commanded to kill the accursed with the very same capability he possessed. There was also the fact that Lunafreya was worried about using this ability. As Noctis understood it, the power would allow her to absorb the scourge, but not purge it. Each time she did so, the menace to which she was host to would surge in strength. The crystal's memories had made Arden's agony clear. To think of Lunafreya having to endure the same was intolerable. How could the gods do such a thing? Responsibility for killing Arden fell on the shoulders of the true king. Why drag Lunafreya into the equation? How much do you know about it? Sol asked. About Luna's power? I guess I've got a pretty solid understanding. As solid an understanding as anyone could have. He'd witnessed every detail of Arden's suffering 2,000 years ago. Perhaps Noctis had already seen more of what would happen to Lunafreya than she had yet to discover for herself. Another thought occurred to him. In the notebook, Lunafreya had mentioned an encounter with the soul of the first oracle at Ralmuel. Did Era reveal to her the truth of what had transpired in their time? If so, that would explain Lunafreya's desire to speak with the accursed. Arden was the only other person on the star who knew firsthand what she was going through. Maybe now that she was privy to Arden's past, she no longer felt hatred towards the man at whose hands she'd perished. Or maybe Noctis was just grasping at straws. The car came to a sudden stop, and Sol spoke again. Listen, Your Majesty. She wore a grave expression. You say you've got a pretty good grasp of what Luna's capable of. But there's something else you need to know. About the state she's in. Noctis nodded for Sol to continue, but he could already imagine what she was going to say. The way she hesitated as she spoke. The fact that this detail was of such import that she had felt to stop the car. When Sol continued to fumble for words, Noctis ventured. I take it she's become a demon. Sol's chest heaved with a barely contained sob, and she nodded. I'm sorry, she said. It's all my fault. She was doing it for me, to save my mom's life, and all she ever wanted was to see you again, to live by your side. She helped me even though she knew what it would do to her. I'm sorry. It's not your fault, Noctis said. If someone is in need and it's within Luna's power to help, well, we both know what kind of person she is. She doesn't hesitate. She just does it, no matter the consequences. The expression of the young hunter's face shifted, now closer to surprise than tears. How? She mumbled, the words seeming to escape from her throat of its own accord. Then after another moment, that's exactly how Luna put it. How did you know? How could I not? After their sudden parting as children, Noctis and Lunafreya had never again spoken face to face. Yet a thread of written words had always kept them bonded. No, she had kept them bonded. Lunafreya had worked to understand Noctis, and he'd done nothing to reciprocate. In that sense, too, he'd depended on her, as a child would. After he thought she was gone from the world, he lived with the regret of never becoming close enough to understand her tribulations. He would not make the same mistake again. Sol, he said with a sudden clarity of mind, I'm not stopping at Hammerhead. I'm going straight on to the city. Pass the word on to Gladio and the others. You're not going to wait for them? The garage is just up ahead. You said it yourself. Luna's anxious to see me. I can't keep her waiting. Waiting for you. She'd written the same thing back then, as he and his companions prepared to embark for Altisha. She'd waited, but he hadn't made it in time. He wouldn't make her wait again. This promise was one he would keep. All right, I'll let the guys know. You can bet good money they'll be racing after you as soon as they hear. A mountain of problems to which he had no answers still loomed. He didn't know how he was going to protect Lunafreya. She had already turned. He might not be able to find a means to cure her of the scourge. Still, inside the crystal, he'd sworn that not another life would be lost. The only option was to move forward. He'd have to deal with everything as it came. Maybe he was being too optimistic. The gods had always demanded the sacrifices be made. In the past, they'd chosen Arden, and the man gave his life that he might deliver his people from the Star Scourge. Lunafreya had offered up her own to forge the covenants. Noctis, too, was commanded to lay down his life at the throne to deliver the star from darkness. Yet even their sacrifices brought no certainty that the gods would save everyone. Arden had not been able to heal all of his people. Somnus, who refused to accept that some of those infected would be saved when others were not, had deemed it more fair to have everyone touched by the scourge killed. How much suffering could have been averted if the gods had deigned to decide that every life should be spared such a cruel fate? By such thoughts, his path became clear. Fulfilling his calling was not enough in itself, and neither was driving away the darkness. Noctis had to see that everyone was delivered safe from peril, equally and without exception. Not a single life sacrificed. If the gods would not ensure that everyone could be saved, then it was up to him to do so, even as just a mortal king. He would go to Insomnia. He would travel the path toward the future he wished to see, the path he promised his father he would take. I wonder if I might ask for your aid. Lunafreya stared up at Arden. That was when she noticed the throne room's other occupants. Several large puppets dangling from chains, each made to resemble some personage of importance to Lucis. A likeness of Regis hung among them. It made Lunafreya's heart ache. How would Noctis have felt if he'd been the one to encounter this display? She resisted the urge to look away, and instead, kept her eyes trained on Arden. My aid, Arden drawled, a look of comically exaggerated surprise on his face. Then, hang on. Okay. Then, with a mocking little shrug. Do you frequently invoke the aid of those whom you're sent to kill? What a charmingly unique habit. I have been commanded by the Draconian to confront and slay you. That much is true. The life and strength I am given now are for that purpose. Of course they are. However, she interjected, I do not wish to kill you. And defy the duty bestowed upon you by your precious gods? How shocking! Arden pondered for a moment, then added, or rather, you would carry out your duty, but can't bear the thought of bloodying your own hands and possibly dying in the attempt. So I am to chivalrously take my own life to spare you such hardships. Really, who knew what dark thoughts lurk beyond that innocent countenance? That is not what I would ask from you. Your death serves only to further the Draconian scheme. Please, you must believe me. Arden's lips carried the same hint of a smile they always wore. What's this? A marionette takes no joy in its master's success. I find that hard to fathom. Not that I have the least bit interest in doing so. The Bladekeeper aims to purge the darkness and the rest of the star along with it. Man, demon, and everything else are to be destroyed. For that purpose, he sends me to amass the scourge and... Destroy everything, you say? How delightful! And here I thought I'd have to do everything myself, when it turns out I can just let the sword fanatic handle it for me. You would perish along with the rest of us. Your point being? Lunafreya's pleas landed on deaf ears. This was a complication she had not anticipated, that the difficulty would lie not in convincing Arden to help her, but in persuading him to listen at all. A whisper of defeat wormed its way through her mind. No words of hers could reach him. No pleas would penetrate his resolve. Arden seemed to tire of the exchange. Pray remember, Lady Lunafreya, that you call upon me uninvited. Please, I implore you, hear my words. I'm afraid I'm not much for stories. Arden stood. Now, I think it's time you take your leave before my next guest arrives. She saw his right arm rise. Just as it seemed their discussion might break down into violence, a voice echoed through Lunafreya's mind. Please, you must stop Arden. Era's words. I beg of you, deliver him his long years of anguish. She could not give up yet. I am here at the behest of Era Miras Fleuret. She has asked me to help you find peace. Arden froze. His ever-present smile melted away, and his face grew hard. If that name crosses your tongue again, I shall cut it out. His lilting speech had turned harsh and flat, all traces of mirth now gone. Perhaps this was her chance to get through to him. With voice bolder still, Lunafreya proclaimed, At Ramuel, I was graced by a visitation from Era's spirit. She... Be silent! Lunafreya had never once heard Arden raise his voice in anger, but the rage that twisted his features was a sight well familiar to her. I will not! Oh, sorry. That was not Arden, that was Luna. Oops. Imagine Luna getting that pissy. And that kind of snarly. I will not Know this. Era continues to suffer, and she continues to mourn for you. If you do not find peace, she will never find hers. I told you to be silent! They stood with gazes locked. Arden's burned with rage of frightening intensity. But she held firm, refusing to let herself look away. At the slightest sign of weakness, his ears would be closed to her words forevermore. She stared back at him resolutely, allowing her own eyes to pierce Arden's, forgetting even to blink. At long last, their deadlock broke. Arden was the one to flinch away. Lunafreya recalled Sol's comment back at the training grounds. She kind of looks like you. Arden likely found it excruciating to keep his eyes fixed on a likeness so close to that of Era's. His smile returned, though it seemed forced now. Ifrit, come, he called. No sooner were the words out of his mouth than a giant hand of flame rose from the ground before Lunafreya. She took an involuntary step back and recalled that among the scenes of the past shown to her by Bahamut, there had been one of Arden giving orders to the Infernian, the god's form marred with the scourge. Be so kind as to entertain the oracle for me. I have other, more pressing matters to attend to. Ifrit's immense form, wreathed in flames, obstructed Lunafreya's view of the usurper, but Arden's blithe tone seemed laced with a hint of vexation. She was uncertain if his smile still remained, but if she had to guess, probably not. If you'd rather not get burned, I suggest you run along home, he called from his spot near the throne. Lunafreya had discovered the one topic that could provoke a response from Arden. He'd managed to kill Lunafreya once in Altisha, but confronted with Era's likeness once again, he hesitated. Era and his memories of her were why Arden returned to the captive pyre burner to drive Lunafreya away. He could not bear to do so himself. I shall remain here until you have listened to all I have to say, she announced. She would not relent. No matter what happened, she would stay firmly planted in the citadel. If Arden set the Infernian upon her, she would simply drive the god away. She reached for the polearm at her back, a weapon brought more out of a sense of precaution than any desire to use it, and readied it for battle. She experienced a shiver of discouragement on realizing she'd fight this battle without Sol at her side, but fight she would nonetheless. She had to. Sorry, I'm also gearing myself up for a lot of Arden yelling, because you know what happens. This is Endgame, you know what happens. I was getting all excited to thrash my throat open again with Arden, and nope, it was Luna. Sol jumped out of the car at Hammerhead, and Noctis took the wheel, speeding toward Insomnia. The drive was uneventful, and before he knew it, he was outside the checkpoint for the Citadel courtyard. Sorry, I can see there's typing, so I got distracted. Ah, okay. Thank you, Maud. Leaving the vehicle, he approached the gates, found them unlocked, and pushed through. This was where his journey had begun so long ago. He'd passed through these same gates, riding in the Regalia together with Prompto, Gladio, and Ignis. Back then, the checkpoint had still been manned, with soldiers posted in shifts. The day was bright and clear. Blessed weather. His father was alive and his friends with him. The citadel and its surroundings were bustling with life as people went about their day. It struck Noctis then just how much had been lost over the past 10 years. He paused as a new concern pressed upon him of whether all that had been taken away could ever truly be restored. A king cannot lead by standing still. He remembered his father's words, and heartened, he hurried on through the checkpoint and into the courtyard proper. The wide plaza stretched out before him, but the world's darkness left the place feeling drab, monochrome. Noctis realized he'd seen the courtyard like this once before, the dream in the crystal, when he was first drawn into it. Endless ranks of unknown foes had filled this space, Noctis standing against them alone. Enemies did not throng the courtyard now, yet it seemed Noctis was still ordained to fight there, just with a different foe. As he traversed the space alone, there was a great clang and a tremor of something metallic crashing into the ground. He instinctively dove to one side and flicked a glance back. A sword was lodged in the flagstones where he had just been. A moment later, in a flash of blue light, the owner of the blade warped in, as if this adversary were a member of Noctis's own line. Great. So now I have to fight the old kings too? Noctis muttered to himself. The warping would have been hint enough, but once Noctis saw the intricate suit of armor, he knew for certain. Around the figure's thick plate mail swirled the telltale black particles of miasma. Though once Noctis's ancestor, this was also of some manner of demon. His opponent offered no confirmation of its own. It simply lurched forward in silence, bringing its great blade swinging down. Noctis's own glaive flashed into his hand, but no sooner had he repelled one blow than the next was incoming. The movements were swift, the attacks relentless. The strikes, too, confirmed his opponent's identity. This was one of the kings of yore, or more precisely, the soul of a king housed in a stone figure, an enemy far surpassing any of the demons he'd previously battled, possessing strength and skill of another order. When Noctis warped into the air above, the demon king warped after him to cross swords in midair. If he stayed on the ground, the blows rained down from above, with gravity adding to their force and momentum. Any distance Noctis put between himself and his opponent could be crossed in an instant. Any attack he pressed might find only empty air as his opponent warped away. This was what it meant to contend against the power of kings. Noctis gripped his sword, dedicating to fight every bit of strength and skill he had. The worst part of it was the constant awareness that he was alone. No follow-up strikes from Gladio. No supporting fire from Prompto. No on-the-spot strategies from Ignis to turn the tide of battle. Now, more than ever, he longed to have his companions at his side. Somehow, in the dream shared by the crystal, he'd been insensate to their absence. But here in the real world, it was at the forefront of his mind. He needed his three friends. They were irreplaceable. But as king, there were things he had to face alone, and when that happened, as it did now, he would rise to the call. He could fight and win on his own. The crystal's dream had shown him that. He would repel this foe, no longer dependent on others as he was in his youth. And if he fought alongside his companions again, he would guard their backs, not just rely on them to watch his. The dream had shown him he was ready for that, too. He parried a blow from a greatsword that was nearly as long as Noctis was tall, then he rushed in at the enemy's heart, taking advantage of this tiniest gap in defense. He thrust his sword into a thin seam between the plates of armor, driving the blade deep, and then in the next split second, he was away, warping high into the air for another strike, this one from above. The shriek of steel on stone filled the courtyard, followed by a cracking sound. Fissures formed along the plates of the enemy's armor, and the Demon King fell to its knees. Noctis still held his weapon at the ready to fend off a counterattack, but his opponent made no attempt to rise back to his feet. The contours of the stone figure grew hazy, then burst into a multitude of tiny particles dispersing into nothingness. When the ethereal mist cleared, a human form remained. Noctis was taken aback. "Somnus Lucis Caelum," he whispered. It was a face he'd seen before, among the memories etched into the crystal. This was the founder king of Lucis and Arden's younger brother. In the years following Somnus' summoning as part of the Old Wall and his defeat at Arden's hands, Regis had ordered the statue of the mystic reconstructed. It seemed Arden, on taking his residence in Insomnia in this darkened world, had alighted on the absurd notion of infesting the mystic's avatar with the scourge. Perhaps he'd been eager to see it spar with the true king once he finally arrived. Somnus looked at Noctis and spoke. "Forgive my brother his sins, O chosen. Anger and the scourge twist his senses. He thought to revel in the conflict between us, to watch as so two alike clash and inflict pain on one another." Sounds about right for Arden. As Noctis looked into the other man's face, he had this strange sensation he was seeing his own image, as in a mirror. Perhaps it wasn't so strange. They shared the same blood, after all. Arden had likely interpreted their similarity as a sign. The true king he longed to vanquish looked just like the brother for whom no amount of loathing would suffice. Thus the convoluted machinations to make them fight. Noctis could see the torment filling Somnus' eyes. "It was my own failing that turned my brother into what he is now," the Founder King said. "Of that I'm well aware. Still, I would beg of you, stay his hand. Immersed in anger and hatred, he lives on immortal and knows not a moment's respite. Please, go forth, restore the light, and free my brother from his eternal curse." The two brothers, as close as could be when children, driven apart by opposing ideals when adults. The relationship between the siblings had deteriorated until finally one died at the other's hands. Noctis knew that Somnus had regretted that outcome for the rest of his days. "I will see it done," he vowed. Somnus nodded. "You have my gratitude." And then, with a faint smile shining through his melancholic expression, Somnus faded away. The encounter with the mystic brought a new question to the fore of Noctis's mind. The gods had given the power to draw the scourge to Arden alone. But why? It wasn't as if it could be given to only one person at a time, or that Arden was the only one capable of wielding it. Both points were disproved by the fact that Lunafreya now possessed it as well. If, in that age-long past, the gods had bestowed such power on Somnus as well, perhaps the two brothers could have greeted the future together, even if their opinions had differed. Or perhaps, if the power had been given to someone else entirely, and neither Arden nor Somnus wielded it, the outcome could have been different. The deadly struggle might have still claimed Arden's life, but the resulting hatred would not have persisted for millennia. Surely all would have been forgotten once two men had both passed from the world. Two brothers at odds, one with a power the other could never hope to possess. In the end, that was all it boiled down to. That difference between them had ultimately drawn a curtain of darkness across the world. The more Noctis thought it through, the more inept the gods seemed to be. Or perhaps it was simple arrogance, an inability of the six to admit their own short-sightedness. Perhaps Lunafreya was now being led along by that same blind arrogance, or, more likely, yanked and dragged along, subject to all the accompanying suffering. Plagued with doubts about the gods who gave him power, Noctis made haste towards the throne room. She'd bitten off more than she could chew. Somewhere, in some corner of her mind, she knew that. To assume she might be able to pull every bit of infestation from the demonified Infernian, it was as rash as a plan as could be imagined. Still, she told herself she had to try. It was the only real means she had to face the deity. "Arden!" she shouted, as the streams of scourge poured into her arms. "Is it not the Draconian who truly deserves your hate? Are you content to be but a cog in his machinations?" The words poured out of her in desperation. She had to get through to the man. The darkness was seething inside of her, and each time her mouth opened, she feared it might be the snarls and growls of a beast leaving her throat rather than words. "Humanity brought to an end? The star wiped from existence. How terribly convenient for me. Now, if only I could find a way to eliminate that pesky god pulling all the strings. Then my revenge would be complete." She saw the twisted smile on Arden's lips. In her struggle against the Infernian, she'd inadvertently drawn closer to the throne. "The Blade Keeper cannot be slain. He exists not only in our world, but also in the one beyond." Arden's eyes widened just slightly. "We cannot hope to kill him," Lunafreya repeated. "But if we can convince him to cast his spell of destruction, he will be depleted and fall into deep slumber." It would be like the Great War of old. According to Gentiana, Terra Flare could only be cast once. If they managed to survive the initial blast, they would be safe. Humanity would continue on. By allowing the Blade Keeper to gather all the darkness into his spell, they could also rid the star of the scourge. 4 of the 6, Shiva, Rama, Titan, and Leviathan, had managed to protect Eos from Terra Flare in the past. So long as they could manage the same feat again, Terra Flare could be the key to ending the darkness. "That is why," Lunafreya said to Arden, "I ask that you give to me the scourge that resides within you. I will pretend that I have slain you, to appear to carry out the Draconian's calling, and—" Lunafreya found herself unable to go on. Her breath caught with pain. Tears blurred her vision. In her warped field of view, she saw the face of the pyre burner, twisted in similar anguish. She remembered Gentiana's tales, and one particularly quiet story shared after Lunafreya had learned of the messenger's true identity. The goddess always chose her words carefully, preferring modest expressions, but behind them was a clear and overflowing affection for humanity. As Lunafreya reviewed the story in her mind, it became clear just how much the members of the 6 that resided on the star shared in common with their mortal charges. Even the anger and hatred they experienced were feelings similar to those of humans. At long last, the pain receded from the Infernian's visage. She seemed to have succeeded in freeing the god from the influence of the scourge. But it came at a cost. The agony burning within Lunafreya had increased several times over. The Infernian turned towards Arden, who once again sat upon the throne. Anger twisted the god's features. Clearly, Ifrit was aware of his own loss of autonomy, and of the fact that Arden had been behind his enslavement. "Insolent mortal," spat the pyre burner. "Wait!" Lunafreya cried, fighting back against the strangling pain. To thwart the Draconian's plot to incinerate the star and end all mankind, Arden's cooperation was absolutely essential. She couldn't afford a conflict between Arden and the Infernian. She had to stop them. "God of fire, I beseech you, enter into the covenant that the king might save our star." The fiery fist headed straight for Arden froze, and Ifrit turned to face the oracle. Lunafreya found herself frozen as well, shocked by her own request. She'd been desperate for any means to prevent a fight, but the idea of using the covenant had come out of nowhere. Still, she continued, "It is I, Lunafreya, blood of the oracle. In exchange for your release from the bonds of the scourge, lend your power to the crystal's chosen king." It was all she could do to manage to stay on her feet. She forced her eyes wide. Tears were streaming from them now, and she could imagine the inky trails flowing down her cheeks. "Let the king have your blessing!" She had not previously forged a covenant with the Infernian. Her demise in Altissia had come before she'd been able to make any attempt, and she'd always harbored a regret deep down at the failure of duty. Perhaps that was why the idea had come to her now. "Please." Ages seemed to pass as she stood on trembling legs, caught between the heat of the flames before her and the agony of the scourge within. In a moment in reality was for Lunafreya an eternity of torment. The Infernian's gaze softened. "So be it," he said. A curt answer, but sufficient all the same. A chill wind blew through the throne room, and Lunafreya saw that the Infernian had departed. She clenched her jaw, resisting the urge to slump to the floor. She knew that if her knees buckled now, she would not stand again, so she held on. Both her legs were nearly numb. The only thing she could feel was the aching of the scourge. She heard a pair of hands began to clap. "Quite the show, Lady Lunafreya." Arden was standing again, his hands coming together with slow, dramatic sweeps. No trace remained of the hesitation and doubt she'd glimpsed before. "And for your next act, you'll deceive a god?" Lunafreya found it difficult to speak. She nodded instead. "You and I shall put on a glorious performance, and that's when it's over. I'll be the one to fall on stage. Is that it? A fascinating proposal. But I do have one question." Arden's smile widened. It was an expression that had nothing to do with mirth. "You've just gone past your limit. Now how will the show go on?" And with that, her vision went black. Arden and everything else in the throne room disappeared. She heard the howling of a beast, and by the time she recognized it as her own voice, all was drowned in darkness. Okay, so my mod had been informing me that there was a break, and I'm going to check and see what's going on at the big old break to see where to stop. Yeah, okay, yeah, this is the place to... This is the place to stop this episode and take a break in the stream. So for those of you on YouTube, part 7, the series finale, is coming next. I'm sorry for tripping over my words. I'm just excited. I need to go get something to drink, eat some food before I thrash the shit out of my voice. So, for those of you watching on YouTube, thank you very much, and take it easy.